One of the best things about fishing is also one of the worst. The fact that you are often alone. On the one hand, being alone is sort of the point. Often, it isn't even really about the fish. You pack up your tackle and your lines, and you head out at dawn with a flask full of tea before the sun is really up and there's still frost on the ground, and you find a spot, alone. Sometimes that's enough. You could argue that for some people there isn't really a point putting the rod out at all. It's not about catching anything. It's about the tranquility, the peace, and the chance to just sit and be. To catch up with yourself and be immersed in your own thoughts for a while. It isn't a coincidence that a lot of people who like to go fishing are men. Nowadays there's a bit more acknowledgement that men need alone time and space, that they are hardwired to need things like time with other men, or to retreat to their so-called man caves. Before the man cave became a thing, we had fishing, a place you could disappear for a while away from the chatter and the noise, away from the pressures and responsibilities. Fishing is an escape, or at least it was. That's when it's a good thing. Sometimes being alone isn't. Nowadays I much prefer to be in the cave and remain safely at home. The thing that happened to me happened around 5 years ago, early on a crisp October morning. I had gone out as usual early in the morning, leaving my wife and kids to sleep in their Saturday and enjoy breakfast together, whilst I slipped out for the morning to have some alone time. I found my usual spot at a local river famous for its trout, but seemingly unwilling to ever give any up. If I ever did catch anything, it was mostly tiny, and even then I tend to photograph it and throw it back. I never took my catch home because even though I loved fishing, I hated the taste of fish. So I set myself up, leaned back in the small canvas camping chair, and watched as the sun came up, sprinkling flecks of gold like a spray of coins over the surface of the water. Across the flow, the trees opposite were still in darkness, and the sky had not yet begun to catch the colours or the light. I suppose you'd say that despite being early morning, it was for all intents and purposes still night. I cast my line out, took a deep breath and let myself relax. Now, whenever I tell this story, people ask me one of two questions. Was I asleep and maybe dreaming, or was I halfway through a large bottle and drunk when I saw what I saw? I can tell you now, straight up, that it was the early morning and I was neither. I was wide awake and stone cold sober. I'd leaned back in my chair and had not even closed my eyes. I was just about to, when unbelievably, I saw the weight move. Honestly, I was stunned. I'd never in my life had a bite that quickly after setting up. Usually when something new comes to the surface, a lure or a worm, the fish look at it suspiciously for a while before they come along for a nibble. The first half hour to an hour is usually the slowest part, but today, one had decided to leap right in. I leaned forward, lifted the rod, and began slowly winding. Even as I lifted, I could feel immediately that this wasn't just a nibbler. There was a weight to the rod that said something was definitely caught on that other end. I pulled up the rod with one hand and had just gotten my other hand underneath for support when there was an almighty tug on the line, and I almost fell forward. Whatever was caught on the hook, it was strong and most probably big. Of course, I'd heard about the fabled pike and carp that were supposed to be in this river, and even one or two tall tales about catfish, but I'd never had a tug this strong. For a moment, I began to get excited. I sat up rigid, planted my feet, and began furiously winding to bring the catch, the reel spinning and spinning as it slackened and tightened as the fish fought to try and get away. The line began to bend, curving into a beautiful arc, and I pulled backward to get more purchase, already thinking of what I'd tell my fishing buddies once I snagged whatever was the end. As it turned out, when I never told them, they wouldn't have believed me anyway, because on the end of the line was not a fish. Reeling the line in, I struggled to keep hold, and watched as the surface tension broke. A small round shape, that I assumed was the head or back of the fish, emerged from just below the surface. I tugged again, until I suddenly saw. There in the water was not the belly of some pike or carp, but a hand. A human hand, all purplish grey and bloated. It was not caught on the line, but was instead holding it, gripping the hook between the thumb and forefinger. As I stared in disbelief, no longer tugging but frozen in place with terror, the hand emerged slowly, rising upward out of the water, like the head and hooded body of a cobra. I watched as the hand, rotted and covered all over with some kind of thick viscous film, like the uncooked liquid white of an egg, tugged and pulled at the thin stretch of line, as someone who had been below the surface of that water, waiting below in the cold and dark, reached up and pulled on the line. I dropped the rod and ran. Now this is where most horror stories would give an explanation. a story or a clue that would wrap the whole thing up with a neat little bow. This is where I'm supposed to say that years earlier, a local witch was drowned in this lake and that she swore revenge on the town. Or that this was where a woman committed suicide, jumping into the water and taking her child with her. This is where the rough edges are supposed to be cleaned up. But I can't do that. It's possible that such stories exist about that stretch of water. It's possible that other fishermen have seen similar things and reported them, corroborating my story. It's possible, but I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know because I've never looked into it, and I don't intend to. I gave up fishing that very morning and have never been back to that god-awful place. I got caught a glimpse that morning of the darker side of reality, and just that tiny glimpse was more than enough for me. After that, fishing alone lost its appeal. A few months ago, I was out in town with my wife, and we passed one of those stalls or stands or whatever you'd call it, where the religious folks stand and try to get people to convert to whatever version of their particular faith they are selling that day. You know the sort of thing, I mean. Straight-backed guys in very buttoned-up shirts and women in ankle-length skirts approaching people on the streets to either tell them the good news about the Lord or the bad news that they are likely to burn in hell. On this particular day, the folks we passed were of the good news variety, and despite my careful weaving to try to avoid them, they insisted on stepping into our path, and preaching not so much to us, but at us, as if their sheer force of volume and interruption of our day was going to convince us to become whatever it was they wanted us to be. I shook my head politely, said I wasn't interested and tried to dodge around the fellow. But he made a nuisance of himself by deliberately trying to get in the way, asking me ridiculous questions like, "Have you ever seen a man rise from the dead? Ever seen a man cure the sick and the blind? Have you ever seen a man turn water into wine or feed thousands with a few loaves and fish?" Again, I said I wasn't interested and tried to dodge around when the guy suddenly asked a question that struck a real chord with me. "Have you ever seen a man calm a raging storm or walk on water?" At that point, I stopped dead. "As a matter of fact," I said bluntly, "I have." Now, in some ways, this may not have been entirely accurate. I've never been convinced that what I saw was a man, firstly because of the long hair and the dress, but secondly because I'm not convinced it was a human being at all. The religious man stopped as if I had just slapped him across the face and asked me to explain, which I then did. By the time I'd finished, he wished he hadn't asked. It was around 3 years ago. I had been down at Anders Pond, a fishing hole that is actually 3 connecting ponds large enough to be considered lakes that drain off into the river that runs through the center of town. It was a popular place for folks to go fishing, and that was exactly what I had spent the majority of my afternoon doing, albeit with very little success. Not that it mattered. For me, fishing was never really about the fish. It was more about the escape and just getting away from it all for a while. Had this been the height of summer, I would have remained at the pond up until the light really began to fade around 10 p.m. As it happened, in early October, the light faded far quicker than that, and by 6 p.m., the sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees as they desperately clung onto the last of their copper-colored leaves. Packing up my gear, I stopped for a moment to admire this sunset. I took in the horizon, the flame-toned leaves, and that low, sweet smell of autumn. I watched the glint of the sun through the trees and the gorgeous shimmers it made upon the water. I saw the opposite bank and how the further toward the ground your eyes fell, the darker things seemed to become. I saw all this, and I also saw the girl. She must have been no more than her early teens. She was standing on the opposite bank almost perfectly across from me. She was wearing a thin white nightdress, of the kind you usually see in period dramas and shows about the Victorian times, and I remember her feet were completely bare. Her hair, a tangled black mass, hung down over her face, so that you couldn't really make out her features, and you had to wonder how she made out what direction she was going. At first, I thought she must be some kind of hippie, walking barefoot along the riverbank, and thought about calling to her to make sure she wrapped up soon, so that she didn't catch cold. It was chilly enough for me to be able to see my breath, so to walk around in that kind of getup must have been freezing for her. Before I had a chance to call to her, though, I saw her walk directly toward me, out from the tree line, across the mud and roots of the other bank. What alarmed me about this was that she walking with such speed that in a few more strides, if she didn't come to a sudden stop, she was going to plunge into the water. Still, she came in hurried strides, closer and closer to the edge, so that eventually I called out for her to stop. She didn't, but she didn't fall either. Instead, she continued walking, striding at pace in a straight line toward me, across the surface of the water. Looking down, I saw that her feet did not disturb the surface, but seemed instead to be gliding, floating slightly above where the water, so that she was not so much walking on the water, but ever so slightly above it. The next time I screamed, it was not at the girl, but in utter terror at what I was seeing. She may have made it completely across the water, or she may have stopped halfway and sunk below the surface. I don't know, because I didn't stick around to find out. I sprinted from that place without even stopping to pick up my gear. When I finished my story and looked back at the evangelist, I could see that the colour had drained from his face. He didn't give any response, but instead just stood there, silent, as if it had been him who had seen the girl. I remember my wife said that she thought it was ironic that someone who was so willing to believe in some things had such trouble believing my story. I'm not sure that she was right about that, though. The way he stood with those wide, blurry eyes, stunned into silence with his mouth slightly open, and his skin go suddenly pale, made me think that he'd taken everything seriously. He looked like a believer to me.